Hey guys, tonight we begin with something far more dangerous than war, plague, or invading armies in medieval times. Dinner. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In medieval Europe, food was never neutral. It wasn't just calories on a plate, it was a character test. Every meal came with the unspoken feeling that someone, possibly God, possibly your local priest, possibly both, was watching you chew and quietly judging your enthusiasm. Eat too eagerly, and congratulations, you've revealed something deeply troubling about your soul. Eating was considered a moral activity, not because food was dangerous, but because it was effective. It kept people alive. It made cold days tolerable. And worst of all, it occasionally made people happy. Naturally, medieval thinkers found this alarming. The medieval worldview assumed the body and soul were locked in an eternal disagreement. The soul wanted discipline, restraint, and eternal glory. The body wanted warmth, comfort, and another spoonful of stew. Every meal was basically a tiny theological debate played out with bread, and medieval people were convinced that the body, if left unsupervised, would immediately ruin everything. That's where food morality came in. Foods were believed to shape behavior. Eat the wrong thing, and you didn't just risk indigestion. You risked becoming lazy, lustful, aggressive, or worst of all, content. Contentment was deeply suspicious. Content people didn't strive. They didn't suffer properly. They didn't complain enough, which made it very hard to tell if they were doing religion correctly. So food developed what we might call a moral alignment system. Some foods were humble and safe. Others were hot, rich, and spiritually dangerous. This wasn't poetic language. Medieval medicine genuinely taught that food could heat the blood, stir passions, and nudge you toward poor life choices. Basically, dinner could ruin your personality, because nobody could agree exactly where the danger line was. The safest option became constant low-level guilt. You were supposed to eat, but not enjoy it. Eat slowly, eat modestly. Eat like someone who could walk away at any moment, even if you absolutely could not. Smiling while eating was risky. Asking for seconds was bold. Commenting that the food was really good today was practically flirting with gluttony. The ideal medieval diner looked mildly disappointed at all times. The real irony is that medieval food was usually bland, repetitive, and sometimes alarming in texture. And yet, people were still warned not to like it too much. Imagine feeling sinful over lukewarm porridge. Medieval life found a way. So before we get into which foods were secretly considered sinful, remember this. In the Middle Ages, the greatest culinary crime wasn't excess. It was enjoying yourself and not apologizing for it. When medieval people talked about gluttony, they weren't picturing someone eating until they physically couldn't move. That idea is very modern. Medieval gluttony was far more subtle and far more stressful. It wasn't about how much you ate, it was about how much you liked it. You could eat a perfectly reasonable portion and still sin spectacularly if you did it with the wrong attitude. Eating quickly was a problem. Eating slowly was also a problem. Eating with visible enthusiasm? Absolutely not. You were supposed to consume food the way you accepted suffering, politely, quietly, and without visible joy. Theologians loved listing the many ways gluttony could sneak up on you. Eating too early, eating too late, eating too often, eating food that was too tasty, eating food prepared too carefully, eating with anticipation, eating because you wanted to, instead of because you had to. If you're noticing a pattern here, yes, eventually, just eating at all started to feel risky. In medieval moral thinking, gluttony was about loss of control. Food was dangerous because it bypassed reason. It went straight to the senses. The body enjoyed it before the mind had a chance to intervene, which made it suspicious. Any pleasure that arrived uninvited was immediately assumed to be sinful. This is why restraint became a performance. People ate slowly to demonstrate discipline. They paused between bites, not because they were savoring the food. Savoring would have been suspicious, but to show they could stop if they wanted to. They couldn't, but the appearance mattered. Asking for seconds was bold. Asking for thirds was reckless. Mentioning that you were still hungry suggested a personal failing, possibly a spiritual one. Hunger was acceptable. Satisfaction was dangerous. Comfort was basically a trap. Ironically, this made food more tempting, not less. When you're told something is morally risky, your brain immediately becomes very interested in it. A simple bowl of stew turned into a test of willpower. Bread wasn't just bread, it was a situation. And the worst part? You were expected to monitor yourself constantly. No one needed to catch you overeating. You were supposed to catch yourself enjoying it and feel bad immediately, ideally before swallowing. Gluttony in medieval terms wasn't a lack of moderation. It was a moment when you forgot to feel guilty, and the body won. If medieval moral thinkers had to rank foods by how quickly they could ruin a person, meat would have been at the top of the list, underlined twice, with a concerned note in the margin. Meat wasn't dangerous because it was rare or forbidden. It was dangerous because it worked. It satisfied hunger too well, and that alone made it deeply suspicious. Red meat, especially beef and pork, was believed to heat the blood, stir the passions, and weaken self-control. Eat too much of it, and you weren't just full. You were allegedly more aggressive, more lustful, lazier, and generally closer to becoming the kind of person medieval sermons were specifically written to warn against. In short, dinner could quietly ruin your personality. This is why medieval calendars were packed with meat-free days, Fridays, fasting days, vigils, Lent, saints' days. If the church could find a reason to ban meat, it absolutely would. Medieval people spent a shocking amount of time checking calendars to see whether enjoying dinner today would be morally acceptable or a small step toward damnation, and yet, meat remained incredibly desirable. It was filling. It tasted good. It made hard labor survivable, which only made it more suspicious. Wanting meat too much was already flirting with gluttony, and enjoying it openly suggested a worrying lack of spiritual discipline. The solution? Replace meat with fish. Fish was considered cold, damp, and emotionally unexciting. The exact opposite of meat, spiritually safe, morally dull. Unfortunately, medieval cooks quickly discovered that fish could be made delicious, which created an entirely new problem that nobody was emotionally prepared for. But even when meat was allowed, it came with rules. Certain cuts were better than others. Certain animals were more acceptable. Rich sauces and heavy seasoning made things worse. Plain, unadorned meat was safer, because it reminded you that you were eating for survival, not pleasure. If you found yourself enjoying it, you were supposed to stop, reflect, and possibly feel bad about it later. Eating meat eagerly was a red flag. Smiling while chewing was bold. Commenting on how tender it was suggested that the food had won. In medieval thinking, meat didn't just feed the body, it fed desires. And desires were dangerous, slippery things that rarely stopped at the dinner table. So meat stayed on the menu, but never without suspicion, regulation, and a healthy amount of guilt. Fish occupied a very strange position. in the medieval moral universe. On paper, it was safe, approved, spiritually bland. Fish was considered cold, damp, and emotionally unambitious, the exact qualities medieval thinkers wanted in food. It didn't inflame the blood, it didn't stir passions, it didn't inspire poetry. Perfect. That's why fish became the official loophole food. On fasting days when meat was banned, fish slid through the rules with the quiet confidence of something no one was excited about. Technically not meat, theologically acceptable, morally boring. Fish was the food equivalent of a beige wall. Except, unfortunately for everyone involved, fish could be made delicious. Medieval cooks were not fools. Given enough herbs, oil, sauces, and clever preparation, fish stopped being a punishment and started becoming enjoyable. And the moment fish became enjoyable, it immediately became suspicious. A food designed to enforce restraint was now providing pleasure, which completely defeated its spiritual purpose. This created a subtle moral panic. Fish was allowed, but you weren't supposed to like it too much. Simple preparations were safest. Boiled fish. Plain fish. Fish that reminded you, emotionally, that this was a fasting day and happiness was postponed. If your fish arrived swimming in sauce, dripping with oil, and seasoned with enthusiasm, people began to wonder if you were technically obeying the rules while spiritually cheating. Elite households pushed this loophole to its limits. Lavish fish feasts appeared on fasting days, complete with multiple courses, rich flavors, and elaborate presentations. Technically legal, spiritually questionable. Everyone involved knew what was happening, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Even monasteries struggled. Fish ponds were common, ensuring monks could follow the letter of the law without ever feeling particularly deprived. The fish was fresh. The preparation was careful. The enjoyment was politely ignored. Fish became a symbol of medieval moral flexibility. You could obey the rules while quietly undermining their intent. You could fast without suffering too much. You could appear disciplined while still eating very well. And that was the real issue. Medieval morality wasn't just about what you ate. It was about whether you suffered appropriately while eating it. Fish was allowed because it was supposed to be dull. The moment it wasn't, it became a problem. Cheese may look harmless to us, friendly, comforting, deeply unserious, but medieval moral thinkers regarded it with the same suspicion normally reserved for bad ideas and strong opinions. Cheese was rich. Cheese was filling. Cheese was enjoyable in a way that lingered, and anything that lingered was immediately morally questionable. Unlike meat, cheese didn't excite the blood in dramatic ways. It did something far worse. It soothed, it comforted, it made people feel content, and contentment, in medieval spirituality, was a dangerous state. Content people didn't strive, they didn't suffer properly, they didn't lie awake at night wondering if they were doing religion correctly. Many monasteries restricted cheese entirely, or allowed it only under very specific circumstances, such as illness, weakness, or special permission, which mysteriously applied to a lot of monks right around dinner time. Officially, cheese was medicinal. Unofficially, it was delicious, and everyone knew it. The real problem with cheese was how quietly it encouraged enjoyment. You didn't tear into cheese like meat. You lingered with it. You chewed slowly. You noticed the texture, the flavor, the way it melted slightly if you held it too long. That level of attention was already suspicious. Paying attention to food meant you were thinking about your body, and thinking about your body led to thinking about other things the church would prefer you didn't. Cheese also had a reputation for stimulating the senses in subtle ways. Some medieval writers warned that cheese could heat the humours, dull the mind, and encourage laziness. Others believed it inflamed bodily urges, though in a slow, creeping way, the kind that didn't announce itself, but quietly rearranged your priorities. Eating cheese alone was especially frowned upon. Communal meals provided accountability. Someone else could see you eating, judge you slightly, keep you honest. Eating cheese in private suggested indulgence without supervision, which was morally alarming and socially awkward. And yet, cheese remained everywhere. It was practical. It preserved well. It made boring food tolerable. People relied on it while pretending they didn't care too much. The medieval solution was compromise. Eat cheese, but feel a little bad about it. Don't praise it. Don't linger. Definitely don't look happy. Cheese wasn't banned. It was quietly distrusted, which in medieval terms was almost worse. Eggs caused an unreasonable amount of anxiety in medieval Europe for something that mostly just sat there and looked innocent. They were simple, nutritious, easy to prepare, and, unfortunately, satisfying. And that last part was the problem. During fasting periods, eggs were often banned alongside meat and dairy, not because they were luxurious, but because they were too good at their job. Eggs filled you up. They gave energy. They made life slightly easier. And medieval morality was deeply suspicious of anything that made life easier without visible suffering attached. An egg was small, but it carried emotional weight. Eating one felt minor, private, almost harmless, which made it dangerously tempting. You could convince yourself it didn't really count. It wasn't meat, it wasn't rich, it was just an egg. And that exact logic was why it was considered risky. Eggs also had the misfortune of being versatile. Boiled, fried, mixed into other dishes, hidden in sauces, eggs had a habit of sneaking into meals unnoticed. This made them morally elusive. You might accidentally enjoy something containing egg without realizing it, which meant you could sin without intent. Medieval theologians did not like sins that arrived unannounced. There were genuine debates over whether eggs were closer to meat or closer to dairy, and therefore how sinful they were on any given day. Different regions had different rules. Different monasteries had different interpretations. The calendar mattered. The context mattered. The mood of whoever was enforcing the rule mattered most of all. This led to a special kind of guilt, the egg-related conscience crisis. People worried whether they had eaten eggs too eagerly, whether they had enjoyed them, whether the texture had been too pleasing, whether they should confess, whether God cared about eggs, whether thinking this much about eggs was itself a problem. Eggs were especially dangerous because they felt normal. They didn't announce themselves as indulgence. They didn't feel like excess. They just quietly made a meal better. And in medieval logic, food that improved your mood without permission was a moral hazard. So eggs were tolerated, restricted, debated, and quietly eaten anyway. People found loopholes. They reclassified days. They avoided asking questions. They pretended not to notice what was in the pot. Eggs weren't forbidden because they were sinful. They were suspicious because they were convenient. And convenience, in the medieval mind, was rarely innocent. Sugar entered medieval Europe like a tiny, expensive scandal. It was rare, imported, difficult to obtain, and immediately associated with luxury, which already made it morally suspicious. But worse than that, sugar tasted good, unapologetically good. And medieval morality had very little patience for unapologetic pleasure. For most of the Middle Ages, sweetness came from honey or dried fruit, both of which were tolerated but watched closely. Sugar, however, felt different. It was refined, processed, concentrated joy in crystalline form. and medieval thinkers had a long-standing rule. The more refined something was, the more likely it was to corrupt you. Sweet foods were believed to soften the soul, not strengthen it, not discipline it, soften it. And a soft soul was dangerously close to laziness, indulgence, and eventually sins that had nothing to do with food at all. Sugar didn't just please the tongue, it allegedly lowered moral defenses like a tiny edible bribe. That's why sweet foods were mostly confined to feasts, celebrations, and special occasions. They were allowed when joy was expected and carefully supervised. Eating sweets on an ordinary day, for no reason, was a quiet red flag. It suggested you were seeking pleasure without permission, which was never a great look in medieval society. Eating sweets alone was even worse. Communal eating provided accountability. Someone else could see you enjoying yourself and silently judge you. Eating a sweet in private meant there was no one to witness your restraint, or lack of it. That kind of unsupervised enjoyment made theologians deeply uncomfortable, and yet people loved sweet foods, honey cakes, candied fruits, sugary syrups poured over bread. Even medicinal recipes conveniently included sugar, which allowed people to enjoy it while insisting it was for their health. Medieval medicine was extremely helpful that way. There was also the fear that sweetness encouraged greed. Once you tasted sugar, you wanted more. It didn't satisfy hunger, it created desire. That made it especially dangerous in a moral system obsessed with controlling desire. So sugar became a moral emergency, not because it was common, but because it wasn't. It was special, and special pleasures were always suspect. Sugar wasn't banned, it was rationed, justified, and quietly enjoyed with guilt. Which, in medieval terms, was exactly how temptation was supposed to work. White bread was not sinful because of what it was made from. It was sinful because of what it said about you. In medieval society, food doubled as a public announcement of your social status, and white bread spoke very loudly. Refined white bread required time, labor, and money. The flour had to be carefully sifted again and again, removing all the rough bits that reminded you of actual work. What remained was soft, pale, and easy to chew, which, from a medieval moral standpoint, was already extremely suspicious. Food was supposed to sustain you, not comfort you. Dark bread, on the other hand, was virtuous, coarse, heavy, full of grain husks and character-building discomfort. It stuck to your ribs and reminded you of your place in the world. Eating rough bread showed humility. Eating white bread suggested you were avoiding necessary hardship, which raised questions about your soul. Clergy frequently warned against the dangers of soft living, and white bread became its edible symbol. If your bread was too smooth, too light, too pleasant, it implied you were indulging in ease rather than discipline. You were choosing comfort over character, and medieval morality did not reward comfort. White bread was common at noble tables and wealthy households, which made it even more problematic. Eating it regularly suggested you had access to privilege without suffering for it. And nothing bothered medieval moral thinkers more than unearned ease. If you weren't working hard enough to deserve something, enjoying it became morally dangerous. Even peasants who occasionally tasted white bread did so cautiously. It was a treat, not a staple. Something to eat quietly, without comment. Praising it openly would have sounded like bragging. Worse, it might have sounded like pride. The irony, of course, is that white bread wasn't nutritionally superior. It was just easier to eat, and that was enough to make it suspect. Medieval morality didn't care much about health as long as discomfort was preserved. White bread wasn't banned. It was tolerated with judgment, eaten with restraint, and never trusted. In a world where suffering was considered spiritually productive, bread that went down too easily felt like cheating. Spices were small, colourful, expensive, and from places most medieval Europeans would never see, which immediately made them morally questionable. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These weren't just seasonings, they were symbols of wealth, of travel, of excess, and worst of all, of food that didn't need to taste boring. In the medieval mind, spices existed for one purpose: to make food pleasurable, and that alone was enough to put them on thin ice. Food was supposed to nourish the body and discipline the soul. Spices did neither. They distracted. They excited. They made people look forward to meals, which was already a slippery slope. Spices were also tied to pride. Owning them meant you had money. Using them meant you wanted people to know you had money. Showing them off, even casually, suggested vanity. A heavily spiced dish wasn't just food, it was a statement, and medieval morality strongly preferred people who did not make statements. There was also the issue of foreignness. Spices came from distant lands filled with unfamiliar customs, religions, and people who did things differently, which made spices suspicious by association. Medieval Europeans often believed foreign foods carried foreign influences. Eat too much spice, and who knew what ideas might follow? Medical theory didn't help. Many medieval physicians believed spices heated the body, stirred the humours, and inflamed passions. A well-peppered meal might leave you warmer, more energetic, and slightly too aware of your own existence. That was not the goal, and yet, spices were everywhere in wealthy households. Nobles and church officials ate richly seasoned food while preaching moderation to everyone else. Technically, spices weren't sinful, but enjoying them too openly was considered a moral misstep, especially if you weren't supposed to be enjoying much of anything. People learned to be discreet, season lightly, don't comment on the flavour, pretend the dish would have been just as fine without the spice. Everyone knew this was a lie, but it was a polite one. Spices weren't banned. They were tolerated with suspicion, used carefully, and enjoyed quietly, preferably without witnesses. In medieval Europe, flavour itself was a temptation, and spices were the loudest flavour in the room. Butter caused an astonishing amount of theological stress for something that mostly just sat on bread and made life tolerable. In medieval Europe, butter occupied a moral grey zone so confusing that entire arguments, letters, and local rulings were dedicated to answering one burning question: was butter a sin, or just emotionally irresponsible? The problem was timing. During fasting periods, especially Lent, animal products were restricted. Meat was out. Dairy was usually out. Eggs were debated endlessly. Butter, meanwhile, quietly waited in the corner, looking innocent and melting slightly, which did not help its case. Butter was rich. It was comforting. It made otherwise miserable food suddenly acceptable. And medieval morality was deeply suspicious of anything that softened hardship. Fasting was meant to be unpleasant. That was the point. If butter made fasting tolerable, then butter was interfering with spiritual growth, which in medieval logic meant butter was the problem, not the unrealistic expectations placed on human beings. Different regions handled this crisis differently. Some banned butter outright during fasting days. Others allowed it in small quantities. Some pretended not to notice. And in a few particularly practical places, people paid the church for special dispensations that allowed butter consumption during Lent. Yes, medieval people literally donated money so they could enjoy toast without guilt. Capitalism always finds a way. In certain areas, churches even used butter money to fund building projects. There are cathedrals standing today that were partially financed by people saying, "I would like forgiveness in advance for how much I enjoy butter." History is beautiful. The irony is that butter was often a necessity in colder regions. Olive oil wasn't always available. Butter was what people had. Banning it meant making daily food dry, bland, and actively depressing, which medieval authorities considered an acceptable side effect of holiness. People developed coping strategies. They used butter sparingly. They avoided mentioning it. They referred to it vaguely. They convinced themselves that what they were tasting wasn't really butter, just fat with good intentions. Butter wasn't condemned because it was excessive. It was condemned because it was comforting, and comfort during fasting was suspicious. So butter remained in a strange position, widely used, quietly loved, occasionally forbidden, and always morally complicated. In medieval Europe, even spreading something on bread required spiritual awareness and possibly paperwork. Alcohol held one of the most confusing moral positions in medieval life. On the one hand, it was normal, necessary even. On the other hand, it was constantly one sip away from becoming sinful. Wine and beer were everyday staples, safer than water, and easier to trust than most people. But medieval morality insisted that enjoyment had limits, and alcohol was very good at testing them. Beer and wine were considered nourishment. They provided calories, warmth, and comfort. Monks drank beer, nuns drank wine, children drank watered-down versions. Nobody pretended abstinence was realistic. Alcohol was part of life, and medieval thinkers accepted that, cautiously. The problem began when drinking stopped being practical and started being fun. Moderate drinking was fine. Cheerful drinking was questionable. Loud drinking was dangerous. Drinking for the sake of joy, rather than thirst, health, or social obligation, crossed into morally unstable territory. The moment alcohol shifted from necessary to enjoyable, suspicion followed closely behind. Drunkenness in particular was deeply frowned upon, not because it harmed the body, medieval medicine had seen worse, but because it loosened control. A drunk person laughed too freely, spoke too honestly, forgot restraint. And forgetting restraint was always the real fear. Medieval sermons warned constantly about taverns. Taverns were places where drinking happened without supervision, where laughter got loud, and where people forgot to feel guilty at appropriate intervals. Taverns weren't sinful by default. They were just environments where sin could stretch its legs. Interestingly, monks were allowed a surprising amount of alcohol. The justification was simple. Monks worked hard, lived disciplined lives, and deserved a little liquid comfort. This logic did not extend to peasants, who were expected to suffer more quietly. The moral line was never clearly drawn. How much was too much? How cheerful was too cheerful? At what point did relaxed become sinful? No one could say, which meant everyone had to guess, constantly. The safest way to drink was carefully, slowly, without celebration. Preferably while reminding yourself that you were drinking for health, not happiness. Laughing too hard over wine was a bad look. Singing was worse. Dancing was almost certainly a problem. Alcohol wasn't condemned because it existed. It was condemned because it worked. It made life easier, warmer, and occasionally joyful. And medieval morality never fully trusted joy, especially when it came in a cup. In medieval Europe, eating alone wasn't just lonely. It was suspicious, deeply suspicious. Food was meant to be shared, witnessed, and quietly judged by others. A meal eaten in private raised uncomfortable questions, mostly along the lines of, "What are you enjoying so much that you don't want anyone to see it?" Communal eating served a moral function. When you ate with others, your behavior was visible. Your portions were observed. Your enthusiasm was moderated. Someone could see if you reached for too much, chewed too eagerly, or looked a little too pleased with yourself. Accountability, medieval style. Eating alone removed all of that. No witnesses, no gentle judgment, no one to clear their throat meaningfully if you seemed to be enjoying the bread a bit too much. And in a culture that equated pleasure with risk, that lack of supervision was unsettling. Private eating suggested secrecy, and secrecy suggested indulgence, and indulgence suggested sin. The logic wasn't subtle, but it was effective. Monastic rules were especially strict about this. Monks were expected to eat together, often in silence, listening to religious readings while consuming food that was deliberately plain. Eating alone meant you were focusing on the meal instead of your soul, which was clearly unacceptable. Even thinking about food too much during meals was frowned upon. Eating was supposed to be efficient, not engaging. Among lay people, the expectation was looser but still present. Meals were social events, family rituals, community moments. Eating by yourself implied you were either hiding something or had lost control of your discipline. Neither option reflected well on your spiritual health. Snacking was particularly problematic. There was something unsettling about eating outside designated meal times. It suggested impulse, desire, lack of restraint. A person who ate whenever they wanted was a person not fully governed by moral structure, and that was dangerous. Of course, people still ate alone. They snuck food. They justified it. They pretended it didn't count. But the guilt lingered. A private meal came with a side of internal commentary, questioning whether this was necessary, appropriate, or spiritually unwise. Eating together kept people honest. Eating alone made enjoyment too easy. And easy enjoyment, in medieval thinking, was rarely innocent. So if medieval people insisted on sharing meals, it wasn't just for company. It was surveillance, politely disguised as dinner. In medieval Europe, food wasn't judged only by what it was. It was judged by when it was eaten. The calendar mattered more than the ingredients. A perfectly acceptable meal could turn sinful overnight simply because the date changed. Midnight didn't just reset the day, it reset morality. The church calendar was dense. Fasting days, feast days, vigils, saints' days, holy seasons. It was a full-time moral scheduling system. Meat on the wrong day, sin, dairy at the wrong hour, questionable. Eggs when you technically shouldn't, spiritually awkward. The food itself didn't change. The rules did. This meant medieval people lived in a constant state of low-level culinary anxiety. Before eating, you didn't ask, "Am I hungry?" You asked, "What day is it?" And sometimes, "What time is it?" Because eating before certain prayers or after certain bells could also be morally significant. Hunger was allowed. Bad timing was not. People genuinely worried about accidental sin. Imagine biting into something, enjoying it for half a second, and then realizing it was a fasting day. That moment of realization carried real emotional weight. People confessed these mistakes, apologized for them, lost sleep over them. Somewhere, a medieval priest was listening patiently to someone explain how a sausage betrayed them spiritually. What made this worse was inconsistency. Different regions followed different rules. What was allowed in one town might be questionable in the next. Monasteries had their own interpretations. Bishops had opinions. Local priests had moods. And God, presumably, was expected to keep track of all of this without issuing a clear instruction manual. The result was cautious eating. People avoided certain foods, just in case. They ate plainer meals on ambiguous days. They justified questionable bites with quick prayers. If something tasted too good, people often paused, not to savor it, but to make sure it was legally acceptable at that moment in time. Food timing became a moral minefield. You could eat the same meal 2 days in a row and be virtuous one day and sinful the next. Consistency was impossible. Certainty was rare. Guilt was abundant. In medieval life, it wasn't enough to eat correctly. You had to eat on schedule, and heaven help you if you forgot what day it was. By this point, it should be clear that medieval food rules were never really about nutrition, health, or even obedience for its own sake. They were about control. Control over the body. Control over desire. Control over the terrifying possibility that people might enjoy something without immediately feeling bad about it. Medieval thinkers believed the body was unreliable, dangerous even. Left unchecked, it would eat too much, drink too freely, sleep too long, and eventually start asking inconvenient questions. Food was one of the body's most effective tools, not because it was sinful, but because it was persuasive. Hunger was useful. Hunger made people humble. Hunger made them obedient. Hunger reminded them that life was hard and salvation was elsewhere. Satisfaction, on the other hand, made people relaxed. And relaxed people stopped paying attention. They laughed. They lingered. They forgot themselves. That forgetfulness was the real threat. This is why so many rules focused not on banning food outright, but on limiting enjoyment. You could eat, but not eagerly. You could drink, but not cheerfully. You could season your food, but not enthusiastically. Every pleasure had to be restrained, justified, or ideally accompanied by guilt. The body enjoying itself meant the soul wasn't in charge, and medieval morality was deeply invested in hierarchy, including the hierarchy inside your own skin. The soul was supposed to rule, the body was supposed to obey. Food complicated that relationship by making obedience inconvenient. What terrified medieval moral authorities wasn't excess alone, it was momentum. Pleasure had a habit of spreading. Enjoy food today, enjoy drink tomorrow, enjoy comfort the next day. And suddenly, you weren't suffering enough. Suffering was productive, comfort was not. So food became regulated not because it was evil, but because it worked too well. It softened edges. It distracted from prayer. It made the present moment bearable, which medieval theology considered suspiciously close to forgetting eternity. In a strange way, medieval food rules reveal a deep anxiety about human nature. They assumed people needed constant boundaries to remain virtuous. Remove the boundaries, even briefly, and everything might unravel, starting with dinner. The fear wasn't that people would eat too much. The fear was that they would enjoy eating and stop feeling bad about it. And for medieval morality, that was the beginning of chaos. After all the rules, calendars, loopholes, debates, and quiet guilt, medieval food morality boils down to one uncomfortable truth. The greatest danger was never food itself. It was enjoyment without apology. Medieval society wasn't terrified of bread, meat, cheese, sugar, or butter. It was terrified of what happened when people stopped monitoring themselves. When eating stopped being cautious. When pleasure arrived without a chaperone. When someone finished a meal and thought, "That was nice," instead of, "I hope that wasn't spiritually inappropriate." Enjoyment was risky because it suggested independence. A person who enjoyed food without guilt might enjoy rest, or laughter, or comfort. And comfort had a nasty habit of making people less obedient, less fearful, and less focused on suffering as a virtue. Medieval morality relied heavily on the idea that life was meant to be endured, not savoured. That's why so many foods were only secretly sinful. They weren't banned outright. They were allowed just enough to keep people functioning, but never enough to let them relax. The rules created a constant background hum of self-policing. Am I eating too fast? Too happily? Too often? On the wrong day? With the wrong people? For the wrong reason? And if you ever forgot to ask those questions, guilt was ready to remind you. The irony is that medieval people weren't especially indulgent by modern standards. Their food was simple, their portions were modest, their lives were hard. And yet, even within those limits, pleasure was treated like a slippery substance that needed containment. So when we look back at medieval food rules, we're not just seeing superstition or cruelty. We're seeing fear. Fear of human nature. Fear of desire. Fear that if people learn to enjoy the present moment too much, they might stop waiting patiently for the next one. Food was one of the few daily pleasures available to almost everyone. That made it powerful. And power, in medieval thinking, always needed supervision. In the end, medieval food sins weren't about hunger. They weren't about excess. They weren't even really about food. They were about making sure enjoyment never arrived unaccompanied by guilt. And honestly, after listening to all of this, you've earned a snack. Just don't enjoy it too much. In the Middle Ages, wine was not a treat reserved for feasts or celebrations. It was everyday fuel. Safer than water, more reliable than milk, and easier to store than most liquids, wine became the backbone of daily hydration across medieval Europe. People did not drink wine because they wanted to feel festive. They drank it because survival quietly depended on it. Water sources were unreliable. Wells were often contaminated by human and animal waste, especially inside crowded towns where streets doubled as drainage channels. Rivers carried refuse downstream. Boiling water was rare, fuel was expensive, and germ theory did not exist. Wine, however, had already been transformed by fermentation. Even weak wine resisted spoilage and illness better than raw water. This made it practical, not indulgent. The wine most people drank was nothing like what fills modern glasses. For peasants, it was thin, acidic, and often several days from turning into vinegar. It was commonly diluted with water, sometimes more water than wine. Children drank it this way too, not as a moral failing, but as a safety measure. A watered cup of wine was considered healthier than untreated water, even for the very young. Monasteries followed strict rules about wine consumption, which tells us how normalized it was. Benedictine monks were allotted daily rations, carefully measured, not debated. Wine was food. It provided calories, warmth, and mild stimulation during long hours of labor and prayer. Monastic vineyards were prized assets, producing dependable yields year after year. A monastery without wine was a monastery at risk. Even nobles drank wine constantly, though theirs was stronger, sweeter, and imported from better vineyards. But the habit was the same. Breakfast wine, midday wine, evening wine. It accompanied meals, negotiations, prayers, and rest. Wine was not a signal that something special was happening. It was proof that life was continuing normally. To medieval people, abstaining from wine would have seemed strange, even dangerous. It was woven into the rhythms of work, faith, and family life. Wine sat at the center of survival, quietly replacing what clean water could not reliably provide. Before it became a symbol of excess or refinement, wine was simply how the Middle Ages stayed alive. Not all wine was equal in the Middle Ages, and who drank which kind quietly revealed where they stood in the world. Wine functioned as a social divider, just as clearly as clothing or land. Everyone drank it, but the taste, strength, and origin of that wine marked status instantly. Peasants drank what was local and cheap. Their wine was usually made from leftover grape pressings soaked again in water, producing a thin second or third fermentation. It was sour, cloudy, and unstable. If it tasted sharp or unpleasant, that was normal. If it turned to vinegar, it was still usable. Nothing was wasted. This wine fueled long days in the fields and was valued more for calories than pleasure. Urban labourers drank slightly better wine, often purchased in taverns by the jug. Cities had stricter controls over wine quality, not for refinement, but for order. Bad wine caused sickness, unrest, and complaints. Municipal authorities inspected barrels and punished tavern keepers who diluted too aggressively or sold spoiled wine. Wine wasn't just a drink in cities, it was a public concern. Nobles drank entirely differently. Their wine was stronger, clearer, and often imported. French wines, especially from Burgundy and Bordeaux, became symbols of prestige. Sweet wines from southern regions were prized for banquets. Spices, honey, and herbs were sometimes added, turning wine into something theatrical and luxurious. Drinking well was part of appearing powerful. The clergy occupied an interesting middle ground. Parish priests drank modest local wine. High-ranking church officials drank like nobles. Bishops dined on fine vintages while preaching moderation to others. This contradiction was not hidden. It was understood. Rank justified access. Wine also marked moments of authority. Lords collected wine taxes. Cities regulated wine sales. Kings granted vineyard rights as political rewards. Controlling wine meant controlling people's daily habits. A bad harvest was not just an inconvenience, it threatened order. Even the strength of wine mattered socially. Strong wine suggested wealth and leisure. Weak wine implied labor and restraint. To drink watered wine at a noble table would have been an insult. To drink strong wine in the fields would have been reckless. In medieval society, wine told a story before anyone spoke. One sip revealed class, occupation, and power. It wasn't just what you drank, it was what your place allowed you to drink. In the Middle Ages, vineyards were not simply agricultural land. They were insurance policies. Owning vines meant stability in a world where harvests failed often and famine lurked constantly. Grain could rot, livestock could die, but vineyards, once established, produced reliably for decades. This made them one of the most valuable forms of property a medieval lord, monastery, or city could control. Vineyards required patience. New vines took years before producing usable grapes. This meant peasants rarely owned productive vineyards outright. Instead, vines belonged to monasteries, nobles, or urban elites who could afford to wait. Peasants worked the land, pruned the vines, harvested the grapes, and received a portion of the wine as payment. Ownership stayed firmly at the top. Monasteries, in particular, understood the power of vineyards. They invested heavily in vine cultivation, often turning rocky or marginal land into productive slopes. Wine was essential for the mass, for daily rations, and for trade. Excess wine could be sold, traded for grain, or used to secure political favors. A monastery with strong vineyards rarely starved. Secular lords treated vineyards the same way they treated mills and ovens. They were monopolies. Peasants were often required to press grapes at the lord's wine press and pay a fee for the privilege. This ensured control not just over production, but over the final product itself. Even if you grew the grapes, someone else profited first. Cities also relied on vineyards beyond their walls. Urban wine supplies were strategic assets. Wine shortages caused unrest. especially during winter when alternatives were scarce. Municipal governments protected vineyards fiercely, punishing theft harshly and regulating harvests closely. Wine was tied directly to civic stability. Kings understood this too. Vineyard rights were granted to reward loyalty. Wine taxes filled royal coffers. Regions famous for wine became politically important, not because of taste, but because of consistency. A king could plan around wine income. He could not plan around weather. In a medieval world shaped by uncertainty, vineyards represented something rare: predictability. They produced year after year, binding peasants to land, monasteries to markets, and rulers to revenue. Wine was power in liquid form, pressed from soil into barrels, and guarded like treasure. Wine sat at the center of medieval Christian life, and that made it dangerous. It was sacred and sinful at the same time. The Church blessed wine, used it in the Eucharist, and defended its necessity, yet constantly warned against its excess. This tension shaped how medieval people drank, judged, and justified themselves. At the altar, wine became the blood of Christ. Without wine, the Mass could not exist. This alone protected wine from condemnation. Unlike beer or mead, wine carried divine weight. Scripture itself was filled with vineyards, presses, and cups. To reject wine entirely would have seemed suspicious, even heretical. But drunkenness was another matter. The Church drew a careful line between use and abuse. Drinking was acceptable. Losing control was not. Sermons regularly warned that wine opened the door to lust, violence, and sloth. Priests spoke of taverns as moral traps, places where souls leaked away one cup at a time. Yet those same priests drank wine daily. Monastic rules tried to manage this contradiction. Orders set limits on daily rations and punished excess. But even here, flexibility existed. The sick were given more wine. The elderly received stronger portions. On feast days, rules quietly softened. Discipline existed, but so did understanding. Confession manuals reveal how normalized drinking was. Drunkenness became a sin only when it led to harm: missed prayers, broken vows, violence, or scandal. Simply enjoying wine was rarely condemned. Repeated public drunkenness, however, marked a person as morally unstable. Reputation mattered as much as behavior. The Church also used wine as a tool of authority. Blessings protected vineyards. Saints were credited with saving wine from spoilage. Miracle stories often involved multiplying wine or restoring ruined casks. These stories reinforced the idea that wine existed under divine supervision. At the same time, wine allowed the Church to participate fully in economic life. Monasteries sold wine. Bishops collected wine rents. Tithes were paid in wine. Moral warnings rarely interfered with practical benefits. To medieval Christians, wine was not a contradiction. It was a test. Drink, but do not fall. Enjoy, but do not forget God. Wine revealed character, not corruption. In a world where faith shaped everything, even the contents of a cup had to answer to heaven. To modern eyes, the presence of wine in a medieval child's life feels shocking. To medieval families, it felt responsible. Wine was part of the household economy, the daily rhythm of meals, and the practical management of health. Children were not introduced to wine as a vice, but as a diluted necessity. From a young age, children drank wine mixed heavily with water. This mixture, sometimes barely more than tinted liquid, was considered safer than raw water drawn from wells or rivers. Parents worried less about intoxication and more about illness. A weak wine drink reduced risk. That logic mattered more than abstract morality. Wine also functioned as nutrition. Medieval diets were heavy in grains and light in protein. Wine added calories and warmth, especially in colder months. For children working in fields, workshops, or homes, energy mattered. Wine was cheap fuel, not celebration. Households stored wine carefully. It was portioned according to age, labor, and status within the family. Adults received stronger servings. Children's cups were diluted and monitored. Drunkenness among children was not tolerated, not because wine was forbidden, but because disorder was. Medieval households valued control. Wine played a role in medical care as well. Children were given wine infused with herbs to treat stomach pain, fever, or weakness. Physicians recommended wine as a carrier for medicine, believing it helped the body absorb healing properties. Honeyed wine soothed coughs. Spiced wine warmed the blood. These practices blurred the line between drink and remedy. Mothers, nurses, and midwives managed wine use carefully. During illness or growth, portions changed. During fasting seasons, wine sometimes replaced food. Wine was flexible, adaptable, and deeply woven into care. This normality extended beyond the home. Schools, monasteries, and apprenticeships all assumed young people would encounter wine regularly. The goal was not abstinence, but moderation learned early. A child who understood limits was safer than one encountering wine suddenly as an adult. To medieval families, wine was not corruption creeping into childhood. It was structure. It taught routine, hierarchy, and restraint. In a world without clean water or modern medicine, a diluted cup of wine was simply part of growing up alive. If wine in the household was about order, wine in the tavern was about risk. Taverns were where medieval society loosened its grip, and authorities watched them carefully. These spaces sat at the edge of acceptability, necessary, popular, and perpetually suspect. Taverns served everyone. Peasants drank after work. Merchants negotiated deals over cups. Travelers sought warmth, food, and news. Winehouses clustered near gates, markets, and ports, feeding the movement of people and information. They were loud, crowded, and impossible to ignore. City governments regulated taverns relentlessly. Prices were fixed, measures were inspected, opening hours were controlled. Tavern keepers could be fined, whipped, or shut down for selling watered wine, spoiled wine, or overly strong wine. The goal was not morality, but stability. Bad wine led to sickness. Strong wine led to fights. Both caused problems. Public drunkenness worried officials more than private excess. A drunk individual disrupted work, offended neighbors, and threatened order. Repeat offenders were fined or jailed. Some cities banned tavern drinking during religious holidays or after sunset. Others restricted women, students, or soldiers from entering certain winehouses. Yet taverns never disappeared. They were too useful. They provided food when kitchens failed. They acted as informal courts, labor exchanges, and message hubs. Wine loosened tongues, and rulers knew this. Spies listened in taverns. Announcements were made there. Control meant presence, not prohibition. The church preached against taverns regularly. Sermons warned that demons waited in winehouses, that sins multiplied with each cup. But taverns often stood just steps from churches. After Mass, parishioners went straight from blessing to drinking. The contradiction was obvious and accepted. Violence did happen. Knife fights, theft, gambling, and prostitution followed wine. But banning taverns would have pushed drinking into homes and alleys where control vanished. Authorities preferred visible disorder to invisible chaos. In medieval life, Taverns were pressure valves. Wine released stress built up by labor, hierarchy, and fear. Rulers tolerated taverns because they understood something fundamental. Controlled indulgence was safer than enforced restraint. Wine caused trouble, but it also prevented worse. Wine followed medieval people into war. Armies marched with it, sieges depended on it, and soldiers measured survival by whether wine still flowed. On campaign, wine was not a comfort. It was logistics. Water sources near armies became polluted quickly. Camps generated waste, carcasses, and disease. Wells were poisoned deliberately. Rivers carried corpses and refuse. Wine, even weak wine, was safer. Commanders issued wine rations because sick soldiers were useless soldiers. Military wine was rarely good. It was thin, sour, and often mixed with water or vinegar. Roman military traditions lingered in medieval practice, especially the use of posca-like drinks to keep troops hydrated. Wine preserved morale and energy. A dry camp was a dangerous camp. Supply trains prioritized wine alongside grain. Wine barrels were easier to transport than water, which spoiled faster and was harder to secure. In sieges, wine stocks were counted carefully. A city without wine would surrender sooner. Hunger could be endured longer than thirst. Wine also played psychological roles. Victories were celebrated with wine. Pay was sometimes issued in wine. Commanders rewarded loyalty with extra rations. Even in defeat, wine softened despair. Chroniclers frequently mention wine distributions after battles, marking survival more than triumph. For civilians, war transformed wine into a lifeline. Vineyards were destroyed deliberately to starve regions economically. Armies burned vines not for immediate gain, but long-term damage. Without vineyards, recovery took years. Wine shortages followed wars like shadows. Monasteries often became wine refuges during conflict. Their cellars supplied fleeing populations. In return, monasteries expected protection or favor. Wine bound military, religious, and civilian survival together. Wine also blurred discipline. Drunken soldiers caused chaos. Commanders issued strict rules against excessive drinking before battle. Punishments were harsh, yet wine remained essential. Armies tried to control it, not remove it. In medieval warfare, wine marked the line between endurance and collapse. It sustained bodies, stabilized morale, and signaled whether a campaign could continue. When wine ran out, defeat followed quickly. On the battlefield, as at home, wine was less about pleasure and more about staying alive one day longer. As wine became indispensable, rulers learned to squeeze it. Medieval kings did not invent wine taxes, but they perfected them. Wine flowed daily through every layer of society, which made it the ideal target for control and revenue. You could avoid luxuries, you could not avoid wine. Taxes appeared at every stage. Grapes were taxed at harvest. Wine was taxed at pressing. Barrels were taxed when transported. Taverns paid licenses. Cities charged entry duties on imported wine. By the time a cup reached the table, it had already passed through multiple hands of authority. This taxation was visible and resented. Wine measures were standardized, so rulers could count accurately. Barrels were sealed with official marks. Inspectors roamed ports and marketplaces. Fraud was common, and punishments were severe. Smuggling wine became a profession of its own, especially along borders and rivers. Kings justified wine taxes easily. Wine funded armies, walls, and courts. Since everyone drank it, everyone contributed. In practice, the poor paid proportionally more. Peasants might grow grapes but still owe fees to press, transport, or sell their own wine. Lords claimed traditional rights over presses and cellars, forcing dependency. Cities negotiated fiercely over wine privileges. Some towns gained exemptions, allowing them to import or sell wine freely. These privileges became symbols of autonomy. Losing wine rights often meant losing political independence. Wine was tied directly to freedom. Wine riots were not uncommon. Sudden price increases triggered unrest. Taverns were smashed. Barrels were broken open. Authorities responded quickly, not because of drunkenness, but because wine shortages threatened order. Hunger caused anger. Thirst caused panic. Even royal courts depended on stable wine supplies. A king who failed to provide wine appeared weak. Banquets without wine damaged prestige. Diplomacy relied on shared cups and generous pours. By the late Middle Ages, wine taxation had become a pillar of state finance. It funded bureaucracy and war alike. Wine was no longer just survival. It was governance in liquid form, counted drop by drop, binding subjects to rulers every time they drank. For all its reliability, wine could still fail. And when it did, the consequences spread far beyond empty cups. A bad vintage was not just an agricultural disappointment. It was a social shock that rippled through households, churches, armies, and courts. Weather controlled everything. Late frosts killed blossoms. Too much rain ruined grapes. Drought shriveled vines. When harvests failed, wine supplies collapsed months later, just as winter tightened its grip. People noticed immediately. Portions shrank. Prices rose. Taverns diluted more aggressively. Tempers shortened. Wine shortages exposed how dependent medieval life had become. Without wine, water returned as a threat. Illness increased. Energy dropped. Medical treatments failed. Monasteries struggled to maintain daily rations. The Mass itself came under pressure. Without wine, the Eucharist could not be performed properly, forcing substitutions and theological debate. Economically, failure hit hard. Vineyard workers lost income. Lords lost rents. Cities lost tax revenue. Kings lost stability. Regions famous for wine suffered reputational damage that could last generations. A few bad years could erase decades of careful cultivation. Social tensions sharpened quickly. Hoarding became common. Elites protected their cellars while common people faced scarcity. This imbalance bred resentment. Accusations of fraud, cheating, and divine punishment circulated. Bad wine years were often interpreted as moral warnings from God. In response, people adapted. Beer consumption increased in northern regions. Cider filled gaps where apples were available. Vinegar diluted with water became a substitute, but none fully replaced wine's role. Each alternative lacked something: safety, calories, religious legitimacy, or prestige. Wine failure revealed its true function. It had never just been a drink, it was infrastructure. When that infrastructure cracked, medieval society felt exposed. Survival became harder, authority weakened, faith strained. By the end of the Middle Ages, wine had proven itself indispensable and fragile at the same time. It sustained life, reinforced power, and shaped belief, but only when the vines held. When they failed, the illusion of stability dissolved quickly, reminding everyone that even liquid power depended on soil, weather, and time. In the Middle Ages, beauty began with a single, unforgiving rule: skin must be pale. Not radiant, not smooth, not youthful. Pale. Whiteness of skin was a visual shorthand for class, virtue, and control. It announced that a woman did not labor outdoors, did not sweat under the sun, and did not belong to the fields. A darkened complexion marked exposure, work, and poverty. Beauty was less about attraction and more about social signaling. Pale skin suggested leisure, and leisure implied status. Noble women and wealthy urban women were expected to look untouched by sunlight. Even slight colour could damage reputation. Chroniclers, poets, and courtly literature consistently praised women described as white as snow, ivory, milk, or marble. These comparisons were not poetic accidents. They reflected a shared visual ideal deeply rooted in hierarchy. To maintain this appearance, women avoided sunlight aggressively. Wide-brimmed hats, veils, cloaks, and gloves were used year-round. Windows were covered. Walks were timed carefully. Some women even slept during daylight hours to avoid exposure. The sun was treated as an enemy to beauty. Cosmetics reinforced this obsession. Women used face powders made from chalk, ground limestone, flour, or crushed shells to whiten the skin further. These substances dried the face, cracked with movement, and clogged pores. But the effect mattered more than comfort. Smoothness was optional. Pallor was not. Medical theory supported this standard. Medieval medicine believed pale skin reflected balance, coolness, and restraint, qualities associated with femininity and moral order. Darkened skin suggested heat, excess, and disorder. Beauty manuals and medical texts overlapped, reinforcing the idea that appearance revealed inner condition. Men participated in enforcing this ideal. Husbands monitored wives. Families invested in cosmetics. A woman's complexion reflected not just herself, but her household. A visibly tanned woman implied financial or moral failure somewhere behind the scenes. This fixation was not harmless. Extreme pallor weakened skin, increased illness, and masked signs of disease. Yet the risk was accepted. Beauty was not about health. It was about fitting visibly into a rigid social structure. In medieval society, pale skin was proof of class, proof of virtue, proof that a woman belonged where she stood. Once pale skin became the goal, chemistry followed. Medieval beauty routines turned kitchens and workshops into cosmetic laboratories, and many of the substances women applied daily were quietly dangerous. Beauty was not just uncomfortable, it was cumulative damage. The most prized whitening cosmetics were powders. Chalk, ground marble, crushed eggshells, and white clay were common among the poor. Wealthier women sought finer, smoother mixtures that sat evenly on the skin. The most effective and most deadly ingredient was lead. White lead, known as ceruse, created an even porcelain finish unmatched by safer alternatives. It also slowly poisoned the wearer. Ceruse was absorbed through the skin. Over time, it caused hair loss, tooth decay, skin ulcers, paralysis, and death. Medieval women noticed the symptoms, but not the cause. When skin deteriorated, they applied more powder to hide it, deepening the cycle. A flawless face often concealed systemic illness. Despite the risks, lead cosmetics spread widely among elite women. They were expensive, which made them desirable. Suffering became part of refinement. A pale, damaged face still signaled status. A healthy but tanned face did not. Application was daily and ritualized. Faces were scrubbed harshly to remove oils. Powders were mixed with water or vinegar and layered thickly. The skin cracked beneath it. Expression became stiff. Smiling broke the illusion. Beauty demanded stillness. Church authorities occasionally warned against cosmetic deception, framing it as vanity or moral corruption. But enforcement was weak. These products were too embedded in courtly culture to disappear. Even convents recorded the use of skin whiteners among nuns. Medical texts sometimes noted the harm of certain substances. Yet alternatives remained limited. Knowledge did not equal safety. Effectiveness mattered more. White powders transformed faces into symbols of discipline and decay. They erased natural color and replaced it with artificial virtue. The price was paid slowly, invisibly, in weakened bodies and shortened lives. In the Middle Ages, beauty was not just skin deep. It seeped inward, one application at a time, until the face became a mask, and the poison beneath it was no longer visible. If pale skin erased life, lips were expected to restore it, carefully, selectively, and artificially. Medieval beauty demanded contrast. A white face required red lips and flushed cheeks to avoid looking corpse-like. Color signaled youth, fertility, and vitality, but it had to appear natural, as if it came from within. To achieve this illusion, women turned to substances that were anything but gentle. Red pigments came from crushed berries, alkanet root, cinnabar, vermilion, and insects. Some were harmless stains. Others contained mercury or toxic minerals. The brighter the color, the higher the risk. Lip stains were applied repeatedly throughout the day. Eating removed them. Talking faded them. Kissing erased them entirely. A well-maintained mouth required constant attention. Women carried small containers of pigment, reapplying discreetly to maintain the appearance of health. Cheek color was often created by pinching or rubbing the skin aggressively, sometimes until it broke slightly. Natural blush was prized more than painted color. Blood near the surface meant youth. Some women used vinegar or irritants to stimulate redness, trading comfort for effect. The most disturbing ingredients appeared in recipes passed quietly between women. Animal blood, sometimes bat blood, was believed to deepen lip color and enhance shine. Fat was mixed in to seal pigment. These recipes blurred the line between cosmetic and superstition, rooted in beliefs about vitality transfer. Medical thinking reinforced this behavior. Redness indicated warmth, and warmth meant fertility. Pale but colorless women were seen as sickly. A carefully reddened mouth corrected that impression. Men admired the result while condemning the process. Poets praised red lips and rosy cheeks, but criticized cosmetics openly. Women were expected to appear naturally beautiful, while hiding the labor and danger required to achieve it. Red lips were not decoration. They were performance. They reassured husbands, families, and society that a woman was healthy, desirable, and properly maintained. In medieval beauty culture, blood-colored cosmetics completed the illusion. Beneath the surface, irritation, toxicity, and infection were common, but the appearance of life mattered more than life itself. Medieval beauty prized large, bright eyes. Wide eyes suggested innocence, youth, and spiritual purity. A woman with open, gleaming eyes appeared attentive, gentle, and unmarred by hardship. To achieve this look, women were willing to sacrifice comfort and safety. The most common technique involved belladonna, derived from deadly nightshade. A drop placed directly into the eye caused pupils to dilate dramatically, creating the illusion of wide, dark, liquid eyes. The effect was striking and temporary. The danger was constant. Belladonna is highly toxic. Absorbed through the eye, it blurred vision, caused headaches, dizziness, and long-term damage. Repeated use could lead to partial blindness. Women noticed the side effects, but the aesthetic reward outweighed the risk. Enlarged pupils were associated with attraction and emotional openness. The name belladonna itself means beautiful woman. Other eye treatments were less lethal but still harmful. Soot, Charcoal and antimony were used to darken lashes and lids, increasing contrast against pale skin. These substances irritated the eyes, caused infections, and clogged tear ducts. Chronic redness was common, ironically undermining the desired effect. Eye whites were also treated. Women rinsed eyes with herbal waters or vinegar solutions to brighten sclera. These washes stung and inflamed tissue, sometimes permanently. Clear eyes were worth the pain. Medieval medicine linked the eyes to the soul. Clear, shining eyes suggested moral clarity. Dull or narrowed eyes implied illness or corruption. Beauty manuals echoed religious language, turning eye care into a moral responsibility. Men admired wide-eyed women without acknowledging the process. Excessive eye decoration was criticized, yet the results were praised. Once again, women were required to meet standards that society condemned in theory and rewarded in practice. Over time, damage accumulated. Vision loss, chronic infections, and light sensitivity followed. Aging accelerated. Ironically, the very techniques meant to preserve youthful eyes often destroyed them. In medieval beauty culture, eyes were portals to virtue, attraction, and suffering. To keep them wide and bright, women accepted burning, blindness, and pain, all in service of a gaze that appeared effortlessly pure. Medieval beauty did not stop at the face. It reshaped it. One of the strangest and most revealing ideals was the high forehead. A tall, smooth expanse of skin was associated with intelligence, nobility, and refinement. A low hairline suggested animality, impulsiveness, and labor. To look beautiful, women literally erased parts of themselves. Hairlines were altered deliberately. Women plucked hair from the scalp to raise the forehead, often working gradually over months. Eyebrows were thinned or removed entirely. In some regions, lashes were sacrificed as well. The goal was not enhancement, but reduction. Less hair meant more beauty. This process was painful and permanent. Repeated plucking damaged follicles, leading to thinning hair for life. Infections were common. But a high forehead became so fashionable that natural hairlines were considered coarse or unfeminine. Hair itself carried contradictory expectations. It was admired and feared. Long hair symbolized fertility and sensuality, yet uncontrolled hair suggested moral danger. Married women covered their hair publicly. Uncovered hair implied availability. Beauty required concealment as much as grooming. To manage this, women treated hair aggressively. Oils, lye-based soaps, and vinegar were used to clean and lighten it. These substances weakened strands and irritated skin. Blonde hair was especially prized, associated with purity and youth. Dark hair was often lightened artificially, even if it damaged the scalp. Grey hair was concealed with dyes made from plants, metals, and animal fats. Some recipes included lead or copper, reintroducing toxicity through another route. Hair loss was common, hidden under veils and head coverings. Hairlines framed the face's social message. A wide forehead suggested intellect and restraint. A narrow one suggested appetite and chaos. These ideas came from medieval physiognomy, which claimed character could be read directly from appearance. By altering hairlines, women reshaped how they were judged. The pain was invisible, the standard was not. Medieval beauty demanded subtraction. Hair was removed, covered, weakened, and poisoned. The result was a face carefully edited to match ideals that valued control over comfort and symbolism over health. Behind the polished appearance of medieval beauty lay a dense web of recipes, many of them experimental, untested, and quietly hazardous. Beauty knowledge was passed from mother to daughter, from midwife to mistress, from servant to lady. These were not written for safety. They were written for results. Beauty manuals circulated widely, especially among the upper classes. Some were translations of ancient texts. Others were handwritten collections of household advice. They included instructions for skin whitening, wrinkle removal, hair lightening, and youth preservation. Ingredients came from kitchens, apothecaries, and animal pens alike. Baths were considered powerful beauty tools. Women soaked in herbal infusions meant to soften skin and draw out impurities. Rosewater, chamomile, rosemary, and lavender were common, but stronger mixtures included sulfur, mercury, and mineral salts. These substances promised clarity and smoothness while slowly damaging skin and lungs. Facial masks were popular. Egg whites tightened skin. Honey smoothed it. Vinegar stripped oils. Some masks included powdered metals or crushed gemstones like pearls, believed to carry purity and strength. Crushed pearls added shimmer, but also introduced sharp particles that abraded skin. Animal products appeared frequently. Fat softened cosmetics. Milk whitened baths. Blood was believed to restore vitality. Urine, aged and distilled, was used to cleanse skin and hair, prized for its ammonia content. The smell was tolerated in private. Results mattered more than comfort. Recipes often contradicted one another. One warned against dryness, another demanded stripping the skin raw. Trial and error ruled. Damage was blamed on imbalance or fate, not ingredients. Physicians and beauty practitioners overlapped. Medical authority lent legitimacy to dangerous treatments. If a remedy came from a learned source, its harm was easier to ignore. These practices blurred beauty, medicine, and superstition into one routine. Women endured burning, peeling, and sickness in pursuit of ideals that shifted constantly. Medieval beauty culture was not passive. It was labor-intensive, invasive, and risky. Behind every smooth face stood hours of preparation and exposure to substances that harmed as often as they helped. Beauty was crafted carefully, painfully, and without protection. Medieval beauty was inseparable from youth. Not maturity, not experience. Youth. Smooth skin, bright eyes, and unmarked bodies signaled virginity, fertility, and value. Aging was not a natural process to be accepted. It was something to be fought, disguised, and feared. Wrinkles were treated as moral failures. They suggested excess emotion, childbirth, illness, or hard living. Beauty manuals promised to erase them with pastes made from honey, wax, animal fat, and powdered herbs. Some recipes included metals believed to tighten the skin. Others relied on aggressive drying agents that temporarily smoothed lines by damaging tissue. The effect faded. The harm remained. Youth was also tied to sexual purity. A young-looking woman implied untouched virtue, regardless of reality. Cosmetics helped preserve this illusion. Pale skin concealed blemishes. Red lips suggested vitality without experience. Wide eyes implied innocence. Beauty became a visual lie designed to reassure men and families. Pregnancy aged women quickly. Childbirth altered skin, hair, and posture. Many beauty treatments focused on reversing these changes. Women applied tightening wraps, herbal compresses, and chemical pastes to stomachs and thighs. Pain was expected. Recovery was secondary to appearance. Older women were treated harshly in beauty culture. Aging faces were mocked in literature and art. Cosmetics used by older women were condemned as deceitful or grotesque. The same practices praised in youth became moral offenses with age. Beauty was permitted only within a narrow window of life. Fear of time drove experimentation. Women chased youth with increasingly extreme measures. New recipes promised renewal. Old ones were intensified. Skin was stripped, dyed, tightened, and masked repeatedly. Men aged differently in cultural terms. Grey hair suggested wisdom. Lines suggested authority. Women aged into invisibility or suspicion. Beauty was their social currency, and it expired quickly. In medieval society, youth was not admired gently. It was guarded violently. Beauty routines became rituals of resistance against time itself. The fear of aging pushed women deeper into practices that damaged their bodies in order to preserve an image already slipping away. No matter how carefully women followed medieval beauty ideals, suspicion always followed. Beauty was desired, but it was also feared. A beautiful woman invited admiration, yet too much beauty raised questions about deception, vanity, and sin. The line between ideal and danger was thin, and women were blamed for crossing it, even when society demanded they try. Cosmetics existed in a moral grey zone. Religious authorities warned that altering one's appearance challenged divine creation. Sermons condemned painted faces as lies worn on the skin. Beauty, when achieved too visibly, became evidence of pride. Yet women who failed to meet beauty standards faced ridicule, rejection, or diminished marriage prospects. The contradiction was unavoidable. Men's writings revealed this tension clearly. Poetry praised flawless faces, bright eyes, and pale skin, while moral texts scolded women for using the very methods required to achieve them. Beauty had to appear effortless. Any sign of labor exposed a woman to judgment. If she looked beautiful, she tempted sin. If she admitted effort, she committed it. This suspicion extended into law and medicine. Excessive cosmetics were sometimes linked to fraud, especially in marriage. A woman who altered her appearance too dramatically could be accused of deception. Beauty became something that had to be controlled, monitored, and justified. Older women faced harsher treatment. Youthful beauty was tolerated as natural. Maintained beauty in age was treated as unnatural and threatening. Cosmetics on older women were portrayed as grotesque or witch-like. The same ingredients once praised became symbols of moral decay. This cultural pressure pushed beauty practices underground. Women shared recipes quietly. Cosmetics were applied in private. Knowledge circulated among women rather than in public texts. Beauty became a secret labor performed in silence. Ironically, the more beauty was moralized, the more extreme the practices became. If beauty could not be openly discussed, it could not be regulated or made safer. Women bore the risk alone. Medieval beauty culture trapped women between desire and blame. They were expected to be beautiful, punished for trying, and judged constantly for the result. In that space, pain, secrecy, and fear thrived, turning beauty from a goal into a quiet burden carried every day. By the end of the Middle Ages, the cost of beauty was visible, even if it was rarely acknowledged. The practices meant to preserve youth, virtue, and desirability often destroyed the very bodies they were meant to enhance. Skin thinned, hair disappeared, vision failed, and illness followed. Beauty had become damage sustained slowly and privately. Women lived with the consequences long after the cosmetics were removed. Lead whitening caused chronic pain, tremors, and early death. Eye treatments damaged vision permanently. Hair removal scarred scalps. Chemical pastes burned skin and left infections. Many of these effects were attributed to fate, aging, or divine will, not to the routines themselves. Despite this, beauty standards did not soften. If anything, they hardened. The damage became normalized. A pale, cracked face still signaled status. Weakness was hidden under powder. Pain was hidden under ritual. The illusion held. Medical understanding lagged behind experience. Women knew something was wrong, but alternatives were limited. Refusing beauty practices risked social exclusion. Continuing them risked health. The choice was not really a choice at all. Beauty manuals continued circulating, copying old recipes without revision. Harmful ingredients persisted because they worked visibly, even if they destroyed invisibly. Effect mattered more than safety. What stands out is not ignorance, but pressure. Medieval women were not passive victims. They were responding rationally to a system that rewarded appearance and punished deviation. Beauty offered security, marriage, influence, and survival. Damage was the price. In the end, medieval beauty secrets reveal more than strange ingredients. They reveal a culture that valued appearance over well-being and symbolism over health. Beauty was discipline, sacrifice, and endurance. The face presented to the world was carefully constructed. The body behind it paid the cost. By the late 18th century, Paris was suffocating under its own dead. The problem was not sudden, but it had finally become impossible to ignore. For centuries, the city buried its dead in communal cemeteries packed tightly between homes, markets, and churches. Graves were reused endlessly. Bodies were stacked in mass pits, layered with quicklime, then reopened once decomposition made space for the next wave. Death was not hidden in Paris. It leaked. The largest burial ground, Les Innocents, sat at the center of daily life. It bordered food stalls, apartment buildings, and workshops. Over time, the soil became saturated with decay. Coffins collapsed. Walls bowed outward under the pressure of bones. After heavy rains, human remains surfaced in nearby cellars. Residents complained of unbearable stench. Bakers claimed their bread absorbed the smell of death. Physicians began to warn that the cemeteries themselves were breeding disease. Paris was growing fast. More people meant more deaths, and the old system could not keep up. Churchyards filled beyond capacity. New graves disturbed old ones within days. Entire neighborhoods lived beside rotting mass graves, and no one could pretend this was normal anymore. In one notorious incident, the wall of the Les Innocents cemetery collapsed into a neighboring basement, flooding it with decomposing bodies. That moment shattered public denial. The dead were no longer contained. They were entering homes. Authorities closed inner-city cemeteries, but closure did not solve the deeper problem. Tens of thousands of bodies already lay buried where no one wanted them anymore. Removing them openly risked panic, outrage, and religious backlash, yet leaving them was no longer possible. The answer lay beneath the city itself. For centuries, Paris had been built from limestone quarried directly below its streets. These tunnels stretched for miles, dark, abandoned, unstable, and largely forgotten. They were empty spaces carved out by the living, now waiting to receive the dead. Paris would not expand outward for its solution. It would go down. Beneath the noise of the city, beneath the footsteps of the living, a second Paris waited, one that would soon be filled, wall by wall, with the remains of millions. The relocation of Paris's dead was not announced with ceremony. It was carried out quietly, deliberately, and almost entirely at night. Authorities understood that moving tens of thousands of corpses through the streets in daylight would provoke fear, resistance, and outrage. So the work began after sunset, when the city slept, and the living could pretend not to see what was happening. Graves were opened systematically. Coffins that had already collapsed were shoveled apart by hand. Bones were separated from soil, sorted roughly by size, and loaded into carts. Skulls rolled loose. Limbs snapped free. Names, identities, and grave markers were ignored. Once removed from the cemetery, individuality no longer mattered. These were not people anymore. They were a problem being solved. Priests accompanied the process to give it legitimacy. Short prayers were spoken. Holy water was sprinkled. This was not reverence so much as reassurance, both for the workers and for the idea that the dead were being moved properly, not discarded. Religion softened what was, in practice, an industrial operation. The carts moved slowly through narrow streets toward access points leading underground. The bones were lowered into the old quarry tunnels through vertical shafts. Torches lit the descent. Dust hung in the air. The smell followed them down. Below ground, the remains were dumped into vast chambers. At first, there was no order. Bones were piled where space allowed, forming loose hills of femurs, ribs, and skulls. Only later would they be arranged deliberately into walls and patterns. In the early stages, the priority was speed. Workers spent hours underground in unstable tunnels, surrounded by human remains and the constant risk of collapse. Many reported dizziness, nausea, and hallucinations. Some refused to return. Others treated the work with grim detachment. This was a job, and Paris needed it done. Over years, the process continued. Cemetery after cemetery was emptied. The dead of plagues, famines, wars, and ordinary lives all flowed downward into the same darkness. Above ground, Paris moved on. Streets were cleaned, buildings were repaired. The smell faded. Below ground, a city of bones was taking shape. One load at a time, lowered silently beneath sleeping streets, where the dead would finally stop overflowing and begin to disappear. At first, the underground chambers were chaos. Bones lay where they were dumped, scattered across quarry floors in pale, uneven piles. Skulls stared upward from the dust, limbs tangled together without structure. The tunnels were functional storage spaces, not memorials. The goal was containment, not meaning. That changed gradually. As years passed and more remains arrived, officials realized the underground ossuaries were becoming permanent. The quarries were no longer temporary solutions. They were the city's new cemeteries. Disorder would not last. Engineers and inspectors began reorganizing the space. Bones were stacked deliberately, skulls placed outward to form walls, with long bones packed behind them like masonry. This was not done for respect alone. Skulls were sturdy, uniform, and easier to stack. Practicality shaped the aesthetic. The result was unsettlingly precise. Corridors lined with symmetrical bone walls stretched into darkness. Femurs formed the hidden structure. Skulls became the visible face of death. The dead were transformed into architecture. Markers were added sparingly. Stone plaques identified which cemetery the bones had come from. Dates were carved. Sometimes names appeared, but rarely. Individual identity dissolved into collective memory. Millions of lives were reduced to origin points and time periods. The arrangement also made the tunnels safer. Loose piles collapsed easily. Structured walls stabilized the chambers and prevented further cave-ins. Even in death, the bones were expected to serve the city. Visitors were not the original audience. These spaces were meant to be closed, inspected occasionally by officials and otherwise forgotten. But humans are drawn to forbidden places. Stories spread. Workers told tales. Curiosity followed. The bones themselves changed over time. Moisture darkened them. Lime left stains. Some skulls bore visible damage from disease, surgery, or violence. Others were smooth and anonymous. Together, they formed a cross-section of Parisian history carved into calcium. There was no attempt to separate the famous from the unknown. Nobles and beggars lay side by side, victims of plague pressed against victims of childbirth. Death erased hierarchy efficiently. By ordering the bones, Paris had done something strange. It had turned emergency disposal into a monument, not one of triumph or remembrance, but of scale. The sheer volume of remains spoke louder than any inscription. The city above continued to evolve. Revolutions came and went. Empires rose and fell. Below ground, the bones stayed exactly where they were placed, stacked, measured, silent, holding up the streets of the living without ever being seen. While the bones settled into their new underground order, Paris above ground entered one of the most violent periods in its history. The French Revolution erupted, tearing apart the very social structures that had defined life and death for centuries. Kings fell, churches were stripped, streets ran with blood, and yet beneath it all, the ossuaries remained untouched. The catacombs absorbed the dead of revolution, just as they had absorbed victims of plague and famine. Executed nobles, anonymous prisoners, and ordinary citizens all joined the growing mass below. Guillotines reshaped Paris's relationship with death, making it public, political, and relentless. Above ground, death was spectacle. Below ground, it was storage. Ironically, the catacombs embodied the revolution's most radical idea better than any speech or decree: equality. Underground, rank vanished completely. There were no royal tombs, no grand monuments, no carved names proclaiming importance. The bones of aristocrats rested beside those of labourers, monks, and criminals. Titles dissolved into dust. As Paris rebuilt itself ideologically, the underground ossuaries became symbols without anyone intending them to be. They represented the cost of centuries of urban growth, neglect, and belief. The city had been forced to confront how it treated its dead, only when they began to poison the living. During this period, access to the tunnels remained restricted. They were inspected for structural stability, not sentiment. Engineers cared about collapses, not contemplation. The bones were infrastructure now, part of the city's foundation in a literal sense. Yet rumours flourished. People whispered that screams could be heard through certain cellar walls. Others claimed the tunnels shifted at night. Revolution bred paranoia, and the catacombs fed it easily. A city already haunted by violence now knew it was built on millions of skulls. Still, life continued above. Cafes reopened, new governments formed, streets were renamed. Few Parisians ever saw the ossuaries directly, but many lived with the knowledge of them beneath their feet. Death was no longer just a future certainty. It was physically present, stacked neatly under the stones. The revolution promised a new order for the living. Underground, a different order already existed, silent, permanent, and unmoved by politics. No matter who ruled Paris, the bones remained, holding the city up without complaint, reminding it quietly that every era eventually ends in the same place. For decades, the catacombs existed in near secrecy. They were known to officials, engineers, and a handful of workers. But for the general population, they were more rumour than reality. That changed slowly, as curiosity began to seep downward. By the early 19th century, word spread that Paris contained an entire city of bones beneath its streets. The idea was too unsettling, and too fascinating to ignore. What had been designed as a sanitary solution began transforming into something else, a place people wanted to see. The first visitors were not tourists, but elites. Scholars, artists, and members of high society requested access. Guided by inspectors carrying torches, they descended into the ossuaries in formal dress, stepping carefully through narrow corridors lined with skulls. These early visits were treated as intellectual experiences, moments of philosophical reflection on mortality rather than entertainment. Authorities responded by shaping the space deliberately. Passages were cleaned, bone walls were reinforced and stylized, inscriptions were added, Latin phrases, biblical warnings, poetic reflections on death. The catacombs were no longer just storage, they were becoming a curated environment. This shift changed the meaning of the bones. Once hidden to protect the living, they were now displayed to provoke thought. Death became something to contemplate rather than suppress. Visitors described feelings of awe, dread, and humility. Some left shaken, others returned fascinated. Not everyone approved. Critics argued that turning mass death into spectacle was immoral. These were not ancient remains, but relatively recent ancestors. Yet the city allowed access to continue, controlled and limited, framing it as education rather than amusement. At the same time, unofficial exploration increased. Adventurous Parisians found hidden entrances through cellars and construction sites. Getting lost underground became a real danger. The catacombs were vast, confusing, and poorly mapped. Stories emerged of people wandering for hours, or never returning at all. As curiosity grew, the catacombs slipped into public consciousness. They became a symbol of Paris's darker side, a reminder that beneath elegance and culture lay something immense and unresolved. What began as a solution to overcrowded cemeteries had evolved into a mirror. The catacombs reflected how the city viewed death, not as something distant, but as something present, layered, and impossible to fully bury. As the catacombs became known, they also became dangerous. The tunnels beneath Paris were never designed for visitors, and certainly not for the curious wandering alone. They stretched for miles, branching unpredictably, looping back on themselves, collapsing in places, and narrowing without warning. Once inside, direction lost meaning quickly. Maps were incomplete or deliberately vague. Some tunnels had markings left by workers decades earlier, others had none at all. Torches flickered, air grew stale, sounds behaved strangely, echoing from nowhere or vanishing entirely. A few wrong turns could leave a person hopelessly disoriented. Stories began to circulate, some true, some exaggerated. The most famous involved a church doorkeeper who entered the tunnels in the 18th century, searching for lost wine cellars and never returned. His body was found years later, just meters from an exit, identified only by keys still clutched in his hand. Whether legend or fact, the story spread quickly, reinforcing the catacombs' reputation as a place that did not forgive mistakes. Authorities took the danger seriously. Access points were sealed, entrances were hidden behind locked doors, grates and warning signs. Guards were posted near known shafts. Official tours followed tightly controlled routes, far removed from the maze beyond. Everything else was forbidden. That only made the tunnels more appealing. Unauthorized explorers, later known as cataphiles, continued to slip inside. They crawled through drainage pipes, forced open forgotten doors, and memorized landmarks underground. They named chambers, marked paths, and created their own underground culture. For them, the catacombs were not a monument, but a living space beneath the city. Yet danger remained constant. Flooding trapped explorers. Roof collapses sealed passages. People vanished temporarily, and emerged days later dehydrated and shaken. Some were rescued, some were not. Getting lost underground stripped away modern confidence. Without light, maps, or sound, time distorted. Panic set in quickly. The catacombs reminded visitors that beneath the planned city above existed a space governed by older rules: darkness, silence, and gravity. Paris above prided itself on order, reason, and progress. Below, those ideas dissolved. The tunnels did not care who entered them or why. They offered no guidance and no mercy. The catacombs were no longer just about death. They had become a test of curiosity, arrogance, and how far people were willing to go to confront what lay beneath their feet. As access tightened and danger increased, the catacombs slipped fully into myth. What could not be officially entered was filled instead with stories. Paris developed an underground folklore, layered over the bones just as the city itself was layered above them. Some legends were old. People claimed secret religious groups once met below ground, performing forbidden rituals among the skulls. Others spoke of revolutionary cells hiding weapons in the tunnels, plotting uprisings beneath the feet of kings and governments. During wars and occupations, rumors spread that resistance fighters used the catacombs as hidden highways through the city. Other stories were newer and stranger. Visitors reported hearing voices echoing through empty corridors. Lights appeared where no one should be. Symbols were found painted deep underground, far from any official route. Whether pranks, art, or something more, no one could say for sure. Cataphiles, the underground explorers, added their own layer to the legend. They hosted secret gatherings, concerts, and meals below ground. Entire rooms were repurposed with furniture, candles, and murals. In these hidden spaces, the catacombs were no longer a cemetery, but a parallel Paris, one without traffic, rules, or daylight. Yet the bones were never absent. Every gathering happened beside skull-lined walls. Every laugh echoed off the remains of the dead. Some found this comforting, others disturbing. The catacombs blurred the boundary between life and death in a way few places could. Authorities viewed this underground culture with suspicion. Police raids occasionally uncovered elaborate setups deep below the city, complete with electricity and hidden exits. Each discovery reinforced the idea that the catacombs were not just historical relics, but active, evolving spaces. For the wider public, these stories transformed the catacombs into something more than an ossuary. They became a place where the past refused to stay still, a space where memory, rebellion, art, and obsession intersected. Legends thrive where visibility fails. The catacombs, sealed and silent, invited imagination to fill the gaps. Over time, it became impossible to separate truth from myth completely. What mattered was not whether every story was real, but that people believed something was happening below. In that belief, the catacombs remained alive. Eventually, the city could no longer pretend the catacombs were only a problem to manage or a rumor to suppress. They had become part of Paris's identity. What began as an emergency solution to overcrowded cemeteries slowly transformed into a public monument, carefully controlled, selectively revealed, and deliberately framed. Officials opened a small, sanctioned section of the catacombs to visitors. This was not the chaotic maze known to explorers, but a curated route designed to feel solemn rather than dangerous. Walls of neatly stacked skulls guided the path. Inscriptions warned visitors to remember death, humility, and time. The experience was meant to inspire reflection, not thrill-seeking. By choosing what to show and what to hide, the city reshaped the narrative. The catacombs became a philosophical space rather than a logistical one. The emphasis shifted from crisis to contemplation. visitors were encouraged to see the ossuary as a moral lesson, a reminder that all lives end the same way, regardless of wealth or power. Tourism followed. Guidebooks described the descent beneath Paris as a journey into the soul of the city. Artists and writers drew inspiration from the bone-lined corridors. The catacombs entered literature, paintings, and later film, cementing their place in the cultural imagination. At the same time, much of the underground remained sealed. Miles of tunnels were still off-limits, unstable, and unmapped. The official catacombs represented only a fraction of what lay below. This imbalance preserved mystery. Visitors knew they were seeing a controlled version of something much larger and darker. The city also tightened enforcement. Unauthorized access became illegal. Fines were issued. Entrances were sealed more aggressively. Yet complete control was impossible. The underground resisted total ownership, just as it always had. In presenting the catacombs to the public, Paris made a careful choice. It acknowledged the dead without fully exposing the scale. It allowed people to descend, but only so far. The experience ended before fear overtook reverence. What visitors carried back to the surface varied. Some felt calm, others unsettled. Few forgot it. The catacombs left a mark not through spectacle, but through proximity. The unsettling knowledge that millions of lives now formed the foundation of the city. Paris had turned its buried crisis into a permanent symbol. Death was no longer hidden, but it was never fully revealed either. Today, Paris moves constantly above the catacombs. Trains thunder through tunnels. Cafes spill onto sidewalks. Lives unfold in apartments stacked floor by floor. Most people never think about what lies below them, and yet it is always there. The catacombs now hold the remains of over 6 million people. Plagues, wars, famines, revolutions, and ordinary lives all converge in the same underground silence. Generations that once filled the streets of Paris now support them from below, literally forming the bedrock of the modern city. What makes the catacombs unsettling is not just the bones, but the scale and intention behind them. This was not a mass grave created by catastrophe. It was a planned, methodical response to urban growth. Death was organized, stacked, and hidden to allow life to continue comfortably above. The tunnels remind Paris of something it prefers to forget. Cities are built on what they remove. Cemeteries were erased, the dead were relocated. Memory was compressed into walls of skulls so progress could move forward without obstruction. Even now, the underground remains active. Engineers inspect tunnels to prevent collapse. Explorers continue to slip inside despite restrictions. Art appears and disappears. Stories evolve. The catacombs refuse to become static history. For visitors, the experience lingers. The quiet underground contrasts sharply with the noise above. Time feels heavier. Perspective shifts. A walk through the catacombs makes the city feel temporary, fragile, and strangely small. Paris presents itself as eternal, romantic, cultured, refined. Beneath that image lies a reminder carved from bone. Nothing lasts. Every city grows, decays, and reorganizes itself around death eventually. The catacombs do not glorify mortality. They normalize it. They show what happens when death becomes too large to ignore and too inconvenient to display. The solution was not remembrance, but relocation. And yet, by stacking the dead beneath the living, Paris created something unintended, a permanent confrontation with its own past. No matter how high the city rises, the catacombs remain below, silent and patient, waiting as they always have. The living walk above them. The dead hold everything up.